Welcome to this U.S.-China Institute at the University of Southern California webinar. My name is Clayton Doobie. Today, our focus is on Hong Kong and its culture of protests. We're going to be looking at where Hong Kong has been and where it is today, as well as discuss where it might be headed. Our guest today is Antony Dapiran, who is the author of City of Fire, The Fight for Hong Kong. Now, here in North America, it's still June 4th, the 31st anniversary of the crackdown on demonstrations in Beijing and elsewhere in China. But it's already the morning of June 5th in Hong Kong, and we're fortunate to have Antony joining us at what there is 8 o'clock in the morning. In Hong Kong on June 4th, even though the police had banned large gatherings, citing the potential danger of COVID-19, a large crowd assembled in Victoria Park for a candlelight vigil marking the sacrifices that were made in the spring of 1989 in Beijing and elsewhere. Hong Kong remains the only place within the boundaries of the People's Republic of China where there is this kind of gathering to mark calls for civil liberties. Hong Kong, as everybody on the call knows, is a vital economic partner of the United States. And many Americans, of course, have traveled to Hong Kong. And Hong Kong's been very much in the news. Just the last 2 weeks, with the adoption of the national security legislation for Hong Kong in Beijing by the government of the People's Republic of China. That measure, of course, sparked reaction in capitals across the globe, notably London, which is making adjustments to welcome, to offer extended visas for people from some people from Hong Kong who might want to relocate. But also, of course, Washington, where there was condemnation from the Secretary of State and then last week by President Trump. We have also seen other governments get involved, including the government of Australia, Antony's native country. Now, in 2019, we saw the jailing of some of the leaders of the movements in 2014. Benny Tai, one of the leaders of Occupy Central, Joshua Wong, of course, one of the folks who led the umbrella movement. And then, of course, there was the presentation of an extradition bill, a bill that would allow Hong Kong's government, facilitate Hong Kong's government to send accused criminals to other places, including the rest of the People's Republic of China. There was widespread pushback against that from business groups, from the legal community, and from the general society. You'll hear from Antony a little bit about that. The demonstrations were often large, and we saw a step up in the police use of tear gas and other tactics, more aggressive tactics, to try to control and disperse crowds. Still, the demonstrations continued, really only being stopped by the pandemic. So it's really quite a striking year. To help us understand 2019, to compare it to 2014, and to understand where we are now, where we might go from here, we're joined by a really gifted writer, Antony Dapiran. Antony's first book is City of Protest, which came out in 2017 and introduced us to the culture of protest in Hong Kong. His current book, just released and a wonderful read, is City on Fire. I purchased these books on Kindle, and I heartily encourage you to read them. He's an extraordinary writer. He's been publishing in a wide variety of venues for quite some time, but this is not even his day job. Antony was trained as a lawyer and has spent better than 2 decades living in Beijing and Hong Kong and working on some of the most important business deals that have taken place in that time. That, of course, is the great age of globalization, China's entry into the World Trade Organization, the arrival of state-owned Chinese companies on major exchanges in Hong Kong, New York, and elsewhere. Antony was part of that. He worked on some of those giant IPOs, bringing mega banks to investors. Really quite an extraordinary range of experiences. We're so fortunate that he's with us today. And so what we're going to do is Antony will speak for an extended period of time, and then we'll go to Q&A.
My prepared remarks this morning, I'll aim just to touch on two key aspects of the protests and where Hong Kong finds itself today. The first, I will talk a little bit about where these protests come from, or why Hong Kong has this incredible culture of political protest. And then I just want to talk a little bit about sort of updates of things that have happened since the book was written, in particular over the last month or two, just to sort of put what's happening now in the context of the protests and more broadly. So firstly, I'm sure many of you saw images of the protests last year on your television screens or online. Very striking, very telegenic in a way, the spectacle of these protests. But I think it's a fair question to ask, how did we reach this point? What is it about Hong Kong that creates these large public political protests, both last year, back 2014 in the Umbrella Movement, and indeed going back into Hong Kong's history. And that's really one of the first things that my book seeks to do, is to take that spectacle of last year's protests and to put them in that broader historical context, because Hong Kong does have a long and deep history of political protest, going back not only to the handover of 1997, but indeed all the way back into the colonial era. In particular, I draw upon protests from the 1970s, the 1960s, and as far back as the 1920s, all of which give context to what happened last year and have direct parallels between the two. And so there were really very deep historical resonances in what was happening last year in Hong Kong's past. But as I said, into the post-handover era, there have been a number of notable protest movements. Some of the ones that you may have heard of or seen if you've taken an interest in Hong Kong's history over the years was large protests in 2003 against a proposed national security bill, and that's all sounding very familiar, and we'll revisit that in a few minutes. Protests in 2012 against a national education, patriotic education curriculum that was proposed, that was opposed by, at the time, a teenager called Joshua Wong, who of course has gone on to become a very prominent figure. And then of course the Umbrella Movement protests of 2014. And in many ways I see the protests last year as a continuation of that tradition. And I think in particular, a continuation of the Umbrella Movement. When you think about the Umbrella Movement, that protest movement was aiming for universal suffrage for Hong Kong. In particular, it was focused on universal suffrage for the election of Hong Kong's chief executive. That movement ended at the end of 2014 without the protesters' demands being met. Many people have described that movement as a failure. I beg to differ, and one of the cases that I argue in the book is that in fact that Umbrella Movement has been extremely important, not only culturally for Hong Kong and in terms of the many cultural developments and cultural movements that came out of that movement, but in terms of growing political awareness and building the community foundations for what then eventually became the protest movement of last year and the ongoing protest movement now. The other way that the Umbrella Movement was important and relevant to what happened last year was the way that, because the government and the pro-Beijing parties themselves regarded it as a victory, they then continued over the subsequent 5 years to repress political expression in Hong Kong in various ways, including barring pro-democracy candidates from running for office, disqualifying them through the oath-swearing controversy when they did win office, prosecuting and jailing many of the Umbrella Movement leaders, and in various ways trying to reassert control over Hong Kong. And as Jasper Zhang, a pro-Beijing politician and the former chair of the Legislative Council here, put it in an interview last year at the height of the protests, he said, well, in the 5 years since the Umbrella Movement, we thought we were winning victory after victory, when in fact we were just, as it were, tightening or even more tightly compacting a tightly wound spring, which eventually burst out with the protests of last year. And so in many ways, I see the protests of last year as the consequence of the umbrella movement and the 5 years of repression that occurred since then, finally having its expression again on the streets of Hong Kong. So in terms of the protest movement last year, it began, as Clay mentioned, with this extradition bill. I think sort of two interesting things to note about that was that firstly, it was eventually successful. The government did withdraw the extradition bill, took it off the table completely, and finally formally withdrew it from the legislative process. So, and this was a few months into the protests by the time this happened formally, although the government sort of from a week or so in said they were going to do this. So the first point to note is that the initial aim of the protest movement was achieved, as it was achieved in 2012 and 2003. But at the same time, by the time the government reached that point in terms of making concessions, the protest movement had already moved far beyond that and moved into demands, of course, for an investigation into the police behavior and in particular the excessive use of force by police during the protests, and into further demands for democracy, again, heading back to that demand from the umbrella movement of universal suffrage for the chief executive and indeed for Hong Kong's legislature as well. I think that when you look at all of these protest movements, in particular last year and the umbrella movement of 2014, what really lies at the core of those protest movements is anxiety at Beijing's influence in Hong Kong, an anxiety that a unique Hong Kong identity and the autonomy of the Hong Kong people to rule themselves is being threatened by Beijing. And that is the core anxiety that I would argue drives all of these protests in Hong Kong. And when you sort of step back and look at the system that Hong Kongers find themselves in, there, I think, are two reasons that lead to Hong Kongers being so active in political protest, which feeds through the various protest movements that I explore in my book through to 2019. The first is that structurally, Hong Kong is a place that former Governor Chris Patten has described as a place of liberty without democracy. So what does that mean? Hong Kong has many of the rights and freedoms that people living in Western liberal democracies have come to expect and enjoy. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, as well as transparent and relatively clean government and judicial independence and a rule of law. So at least in terms of rights and freedoms, Hong Kong looks and feels a lot like a Western liberal democracy. But of course, it's not a democracy. People cannot choose the head of the government. That's chosen by a small circle election committee of only 1,200, mostly pro-Beijing business people and other professionals. And our legislature, the equivalent of our parliament or our Congress, the Legislative Council, is elected only half by a universal suffrage from geographic seats, the other half, again, by small circle, generally pro-Beijing professional electorate groups called functional constituencies. That means that structurally, the LegCo, by design, will always be in the hands of the pro-Beijing parties. The pro-democracy parties, try as they might, structurally it's near impossible for them to win a majority. And so Hong Kong people are left with this situation where, in terms of political expression, they can't vote in who they wish to govern them. If they're unhappy with the way the city is being governed, or if they're unhappy with any policy proposed by the government, they can't vote the government out, as people would do in other democratic countries. But they can take to the streets using those rights and freedoms that they do have and to protest. And so this channel of political protest becomes a key means of political expression in Hong Kong and a key means of affecting change in Hong Kong. And as was shown not only by the successful protest of last year in terms of stopping the extradition bill, but also going back to the national education protests in 2012, Article 23 in 2003, it has been shown to be an effective means of affecting political change in Hong Kong. So that's the first thing driving political protest in Hong Kong. The second, and I would argue perhaps even more important, is the connection between political protest and Hong Kong identity. And this was something that was really highlighted, I think, in the protests last year. So as I mentioned, Hong Kong has these rights and freedoms that it enjoys that makes it distinct not only from the rest of China, but in many ways from much of the rest of Asia. So previously, going back to the pre-handover era, when Hong Kong wanted to talk about what made Hong Kong different, what distinguished it from the rest of China in particular, the most immediate obvious thing to point to were material factors, that Hong Kong was wealthy, technologically developed, whereas the rest of China was poor and backward. Now, of course, in the intervening 20-some years since the handover, that has changed remarkably. China is no longer poor and backwards. China is now in a wealthy, economically developed country and one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world as well. So Hong Kong no longer has that aspect to distinguish its identity. But what Hong Kong does have that the rest of China doesn't have are these rights and freedoms. They're something that Hong Kongers are rightly very proud of. It's the thing that the rest of the world distinguishes when they look at Hong Kong. When businesses look at Hong Kong, they look at Hong Kong's rule of law and rights and freedoms that make it an attractive place to do business compared to the rest of China and much of the rest of Asia. And it's come to be referred to as Hong Kong core values, these sort of values that make Hong Kong special and different. And so when you look at the various protest movements, and in particular the protest movement of last year, what people are protesting at are things that threaten those core values, that threaten those rights and freedoms. So in particular, the extradition bill was threatening the firewall between the Hong Kong justice system and the mainland justice system, threatening to make that wall porous. And so, again, that combination of anxiety at Beijing's influence and anxiety at people's rights and freedoms here being restricted in some way drove people to come out onto the streets and protest. And in that very act of protest, they are exercising those rights and freedoms. And so, in a way, to protest in Hong Kong becomes a performance of identity in Hong Kong. And that really grew and developed, I think, in particular through the very long protest movement that we saw last year and heading into this year. And I think found its expression in the protest slogan, Gong Fu Hong Kong, Si Doi Gap Meng, which is Reclaim Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Times, and in the protest anthem, Glory to Hong Kong, this song that people would sing at protests, what people refer to as perhaps as a Hong Kong anthem or a protest anthem. These are expressions of identity, and I think the best way to sum up what it is that many people were out there protesting about, and what it was that drove that protest movement over so many months and continues to give it energy going into this year. So that's the Hong Kong side of what was driving what happened and how we came to that point. But of course, there's another side to the story, and that is Beijing. The protest movement last year in Hong Kong really represented the most serious and the most sustained challenge to party rule in China, at least since 1989. And arguably, in some respects, going all the way back to 1949. And I think any of you who are students of Hong Kong politics or Hong Kong history will know that the party doesn't like to have its rule challenged. Now, notwithstanding dire predictions of perhaps some forceful intervention in Hong Kong last year, a lot of people at various points talked about whether the Beijing would send in the People's Liberation Army. They didn't, and in fact, Beijing's response last year was fairly restrained. But I think it was clear that Hong Kong was never going to be allowed this level of open defiance that they displayed in the course of last year. And so it was just a matter of time before there was some kind of reckoning from Beijing. And now in the last month or two, we are seeing that reckoning begin to take shape. The most obvious way in which that is taking shape is, of course, the national security law, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But just to mention some of the other things that have been building up to that. The first has been the continuation of a campaign of what I have referred to as lawfare. Lawfare is the use by the Hong Kong government of the Hong Kong legal system to target dissent, to target its political opponents, and to use the legal system in a very targeted and careful way to repress dissent. That's something that goes back at least to the umbrella movement, with the way in which the legal system was used to stop the umbrella movement, and then the prosecution of the umbrella movement leaders. And this is something that I go into again in really some detail in the book. It was shown through the use of the legal system to disqualify legislative council candidates and to disqualify duly elected members of the Legislative Council on the pro-democracy side. And it continues into this year with the targeting of various protest leaders and activists. It's continuing with the prosecution and jailing of people arrested during the protests. And bearing in mind, there were over 7,000 people arrested in the course of the protest last year. Those trials are just starting to work their way through the court system now. And what we see is, in terms of the way that prosecutors make their decisions, in terms of the way that they ask the courts to carry out sentencing, the authorities consistently will press the most serious charges on protesters and push for the heaviest sentences possible. And when it's compared to, for example, the sentences given to people on the pro-Beijing side who might have committed crimes in the course of the events of last year, sometimes the results can be quite stark. And just one example to illustrate this, in the same week we had a protester who was a 21-year-old lifeguard involved in one of the melees with the police lines, the sort of struggles between the protester and police lines outside the Legislative Council in the very early days of the protests last year. He wasn't proved to have injured anyone, but he was throwing objects, throwing plastic hard hats and things at the police line. He was convicted of riot and sentenced to 4 years jail. The same week, a pro-Beijing person who took a number of knives, went to a Lenin Wall, one of these sites of dissent in Hong Kong, where pro-democracy people would post artwork and slogans and posters supporting the movement. This man went to a Lenin Wall and in a premeditated attack stabbed 3 people, hospitalizing all 3 of them, one of them in critical condition. He was sentenced to only 45 months jail. That's less than the 48 months that the rioter received. And the judge, in convicting him, gave very sympathetic comments, saying this poor man was really a victim of the protests. His livelihood had been threatened, and it was unfortunate that he was sort of pushed to this. And the court was extremely sympathetic in sentencing him. And that's just one example of the different treatment that protesters receive as compared to other people are receiving in the court system. And there are many other examples, but we don't have the time to go into them. And then, of course, the legal system is being used to target politicians as well. So a number of the Democratic Legislative Council members are being charged with criminal charges for some of their protest actions inside the Legislative Council. And this campaign of lawfare will continue. The second step has been the introduction of the National Anthem Law. This is a law that makes it a criminal offence to insult or disrespect the Chinese national anthem in Hong Kong, punishable by up to 3 years in prison. That law was just passed into law rather auspiciously or inauspiciously, as the case may be, yesterday. So on the 4th of June, here in Hong Kong, the government marked the occasion by passing the National Anthem Law in the Legislative Council. What was interesting was the way in which the pro-Beijing parties positioned themselves to be able to do that. The Legislative Council had been stuck in a deadlock due to a procedural technicality that the pro-democracy parties had a temporary chairmanship of a key committee and were filibustering to stop that committee proceeding to enable business to proceed in the Legislative Council. What the pro-Beijing parties did is, with the support of the Legislative Council security guards, supposedly a neutral body just there to keep order in the Legislative Council, the pro-Beijing parties used the muscle of the of the Legislative Council security guards to physically prevent the Democratic councillors reaching the chairman's seat in the meeting room. Sort of the security guards shepherded the pro-Beijing member into the chairman's seat, and from the chairman's seat, she then proceeded to chair the meeting and push the business through that would enable the National Anthem Law to be passed. So again, a clear use of the official legal and political system combined with just sheer brute force to put the pro-Beijing parties into a position to be able to pass that national anthem law. And the final, because we don't have a lot of time, but the final and then most dramatic expression of Beijing reasserting its control over Hong Kong and a reckoning of sorts coming for the protests of last year has been, of course, this national security law. So what exactly is it, or what is Beijing proposing to do? Just one step back by way of background. Article 23 in Hong Kong's constitution, the basic law, says that the Hong Kong legislature should, on its own, enact laws to prevent secession, sedition, subversion of the Central People's Government. In 2003, the Hong Kong government tried to pass that law. They proposed that law, but as I mentioned earlier, large street protests prevented that from going ahead. The government at that point withdrew that proposed law and hasn't introduced it ever since. In the intervening years, and in particular with the events of last year, Beijing increasingly made noises about the need for this Article 23 law to come into force. At the same time, I think Beijing was watching a number of things. They were watching the events of last year with increasing nervousness. One aspect of the events of last year that was particularly troubling to Beijing was the occasional calls or slogans for Hong Kong independence. Now, of course, territorial integrity is one of the central concerns of the Communist Party and party rule over that territory. It ties into this narrative of the century of national humiliation, which is one of the key narratives that the Communist Party relies on to legitimate its rule, and it's an extremely sensitive topic in Beijing. So to touch that third rail of talk about Hong Kong independence was something that really infuriated Beijing. Then there was, of course, that open defiance of Beijing's rule that we saw on the streets of Hong Kong. Slogans such as "Tian Mian Zhonggong," "Heaven destroy the Communist Party," being shown at protests here on protest slogans. These sorts of things that the Communist Party in Beijing simply could not abide, and they wanted a very clear message to show that it would not be tolerated. At the same time, Beijing looked at the dysfunction in Hong Kong's Legislative Council, the deadlocks that I was just referring to, the fact that the Legislative Council was an obvious target also for political protest in the way that the protesters last year were able to target the Hong Kong legislative process, protest outside the Legislative Council and prevent that extradition law going ahead. And I think Beijing is also looking at the role that Hong Kong is playing in the broader context of the US relationship with China, and perhaps the way that the wider world is looking to use Hong Kong as a point of leverage with China. And China decided to act and to make a very clear and unambiguous statement about Beijing's rule over Hong Kong. And so Beijing announced that they would be enacting a new national security law for Hong Kong that would, in Hong Kong, criminalize acts of secession, subversion, terrorism, and foreign interference in Hong Kong. Beijing would do that not by the Hong Kong legislature on its own enacting that law as the basic law provides, but by the National People's Congress in Beijing themselves drafting the law for Hong Kong and imposing it on Hong Kong by executive fiat. And this would take the matter out of the hands of the Hong Kong legislature, out of the hands of the Hong Kong government, and Beijing was just imposing this, proposes to impose this directly on Hong Kong. So last week, the National People's Congress passed the decision that empowers the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress to go ahead and make that law, and we expect that law to be drafted and enacted over the course of the next 2 months or so. Now that, of course, prompted a very strong response from the rest of the world, and in particular from the United States. It so happened that the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which the Congress enacted last year, requires the Secretary of State to certify to Congress each year that Hong Kong has an appropriate degree of autonomy from Beijing to enable Hong Kong to continue to enjoy the various kinds of special treatment that it enjoys from the US, the special status that it enjoys with the US compared to the rest of China in terms of the bilateral relationship. After the National People's Congress announced that it was going to be taking this step, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo last week went ahead to give his first certification under the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. And in fact, he did certify that Hong Kong is no longer sufficiently autonomous. And to follow up from that announcement on last Friday, President Trump announced that he would, as a result of Pompeo's certification, begin to instruct his administration to take steps to unwind in various ways that relationship. Now, I think it's important to note that there's been no specific action taken yet. And indeed, in his announcement, while President Trump touched upon a number of areas that might be the target of US action, there were no specific policy actions mentioned. So we don't yet know exactly what shape that will take. And it might go from relatively small and also relatively obvious steps, things like rescinding the extradition bill that the US currently has with Hong Kong. It doesn't have one with the rest of China, of course, but there is an extradition treaty between the US and Hong Kong, which, of course, once the national security law comes into force here, if that treaty remained in place, would enable the Hong Kong government to demand the US extradite to Hong Kong fugitives that were wanted under this national security law. So that's something that, one aspect of the bilateral relationship between the US and Hong Kong that obviously has to change. The other aspect that seems obvious in the broader context of the US-China relationship is to apply export controls to Hong Kong at the same level that they're applied to the rest of China. That is, to have, in particular, dual-use technologies, the export of dual-use technologies to be restricted to Hong Kong in the same way that they're restricted to the rest of China. And again, given the context of the bilateral relationship, where that stands, given that Hong Kong is both geographically and politically so close to the rest of China, and indeed Hong Kong has been used to evade US sanctions in the past, and the ongoing Huawei case is an example where that specific thing is alleged. It's not a surprise that perhaps those controls should be extended to Hong Kong. So there's some of the more minor steps. The major step, sort of the nuclear option, if you want to put it that way, is for the customs treatment of Hong Kong to be removed entirely, and for Hong Kong, in terms of its customs relationship with the US, to be treated exactly the same as the rest of China. And that means things like tariffs, export controls, standards, and indeed visa treatment for Hong Kong citizens would all be reverted to the same treatment that is given to the rest of China in the bilateral relationship. That would be a major step, would be very disruptive, not only to Hong Kong people and Hong Kong businesses, but also to US and other international businesses operating in Hong Kong. So it would be interesting to see how far the US goes in these measures. And I dare say they'll be waiting to see how China progresses the national security legislation itself. Will it be as draconian as people fear? What form will it take? How will it be applied? These are all things that are waiting to be seen. But just to bring it back to Hong Kong, to conclude my remarks, clearly one of the aims of the national security law and the way it's being applied by Beijing is to try and stifle dissent in Hong Kong. I think that the message from Beijing is to tell people of Hong Kong, any resistance is futile. There's no point protesting. We're not even going to give you a chance to protest outside your legislative council. We're doing this all in Beijing. They are trying to break the spirit of Hong Kong's protest movement and to try and reset the expectations of what Hong Kong's pro-democracy politicians and the protesters can achieve in Hong Kong. And so the question is going to be, how does the protest movement and how do Hong Kongers respond to that? Will they give up in despair and accept their fate, or will they continue to fight? And last night here in Hong Kong on the 4th of June, we perhaps saw an answer to that question from Hong Kongers. Every year, as Clay mentioned at the outset, Hong Kong has a large vigil to commemorate the Tiananmen Square massacre. On the 4th of June every year in Victoria Park, people gather for a candlelight vigil. Hundreds of thousands sometimes gather there. Last night, for the first time since 1989, that vigil was banned by the government on grounds of social distancing and health reasons, given the ongoing virus situation. The government banned that gathering from going ahead. Now, this is notwithstanding the virus being very much under control here in Hong Kong, and so many people, including medical experts, were questioning the scientific as opposed to political basis for that ban that the government implemented. But nevertheless, the government said that the vigil would not be allowed to go ahead this year. They fenced off Victoria Park, barricaded off the playing fields where that vigil normally takes place, and deployed thousands of riot police around the city and told people not to come out. But what happened last night was that thousands of Hong Kongers came out anyway. They defied the ban. They defied the police. They went to the park. They pushed down the barricades and gathered on those playing fields and held that vigil in any event. It went ahead. And it was, at least for me, a very moving experience to see that. It was a very clear message of defiance from the Hong Kong people, and perhaps their first answer to Beijing's question, or their first response to Beijing's measure or Beijing's attempt to stifle them. And I think that the message that the Hong Kong people were giving was that they are not going to be stifled, and they are going to continue to speak up. So that's so I've gone a little long, but that's all I'm going to say in terms of prepared remarks. And I'm happy to take your questions and engage in some more discussion.
Antony, thank you. That was just fantastic. You really covered a lot of ground, and I want to remind those on the call, this is a rich book, and we'll try in the Q&A to touch on some of the things that Antony maybe didn't get to, but also go quite deep into some of the questions that you folks have raised. And one of the questions, in fact, one of the last questions submitted, and you're still welcome to contribute, is about learning. And I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about how the Hong Kong government learned, what lessons they took from 2014, and how they then used different tactics in 2019, but also how the protesters learned. And it's really quite striking. Now, you emphasized some of the continuity between 2014 and 2019, but in the book, you also highlight some significant differences. So maybe you could say something about learning new tactics.
Certainly. So to address both the government side and the protester side, and perhaps the government side first, because it's the less interesting. The government, it seems, took entirely the wrong lesson from the umbrella movement. The government saw that protest movement eventually fizzled out. They saw that other potential causes for protest in the intervening years, such as the disqualification of the legislators, or the institution of the new high-speed rail station with the institution of mainland Chinese law inside that railway station, all potential flashpoints for protest didn't attract much public outcry. And the government's lesson from that was that they thought that dissent was dead in Hong Kong, and that the breaking of the umbrella movement had led to that. And that emboldened them to go ahead with the extradition bill last year, thinking that there wouldn't be any great pushback. And the government very quickly learned that they'd taken the wrong lesson from the umbrella movement, and that there was a significant pushback. The other thing I think the government failed to learn was that they continued to fail to engage the community, failed to engage the protesters or engage their demands, hoping that it would just fizzle out. A similar thing they did in the umbrella movement, except that this time it didn't fizzle out. It carried on, the anger burned and continued, and the only thing that made the protest movement stop, other than the virus, of course, was in fact the elections last year, the district council elections in November of last year, towards the end of last year's protests. People expressed their views at the ballot box. The Pan-Democrat parties won in a landslide. And I think that led people to have a sense that, well, we've won a victory here. We've had an outcome. And a great example of how democracy can diffuse political tensions and enable people to politically express themselves, meaning there's no need for protests on the street. So, but again, the government did not seem to learn from that either. So in terms of learning, the government's been learning all the wrong lessons. The protesters, on the other hand, and this is a much more interesting aspect, the protesters learned much from the quote-unquote failure of the umbrella movement. The key lesson they learned is that a sort of extended static occupation in the streets, as was inspired by the Occupy Wall Street movement, didn't work. They weren't able to force the government to the negotiating table in terms of through an occupation strategy. The other thing they learned is that having prominent leaders and spokespeople simply creates targets for government crackdowns. The leaders are all arrested and jailed and pursued by the authorities. And so last year's 2019 protests learned directly from those lessons of the umbrella movement. And you saw that manifested in a couple of ways. Firstly, the movement was leaderless. There was, unlike the umbrella movement, no spokespeople on a central stage addressing the crowds, directing the movement. The movement was very much organic, ground up, enabled by technology such as chat groups on mobile phones and internet bulletin boards. All these technologies, of course, existed back in 2014, but they weren't being used in the way they were used last year. The movement organized itself in this leaderless way from the ground up, and that enabled it to be incredibly resilient, partly because there was no head that could be chopped off, but also because it really made the participants in the movement to feel very empowered. Speaking to people on the streets, they would say, "Oh, I feel this is wonderful because I can contribute as much as I want. I can come out and do whatever it is that I'm able to do, and there's no one telling me what to do." It was an empowering, and for that reason, some people have described as leaderful rather than leaderless movement. So that was the first key lesson learned from the umbrella movement. And the second was this idea of static occupations was abandoned in favor of a new tactic that people have referred to as be water, inspired by Bruce Lee, of course, and Bruce Lee himself inspired by Lao Tzu and Sun Tzu. But that the idea that a static occupation doesn't work, and if a protest is very fluid, moves around the city, moves to different targets, if it meets resistance in the forms of police to disperse and go somewhere else, it again made the protest very resilient, difficult to police, difficult to enforce. If you didn't have people sitting in one static location, the police couldn't encircle and arrest them. And so in this way, the protest moved throughout the city, and indeed not just around Hong Kong Island and the traditional protest district, if you will, but throughout all of Hong Kong and across all the different districts up into Kowloon and the New Territories as well. And so this was another key lesson from the umbrella movement, that people were being very fluid, this be water approach to protest. And so that has I think helped in many ways, helped them be more successful than they were in 2014. And it's been interesting to see these tactics and this sort of mindset, as well as the more on the ground tactics, such as the ways to put out tear gas, or the ways to stop rubber bullets, or the ways to organize, being used around the world. And we saw them in Catalonia, we saw them with Extinction Rebellion protesters in the UK targeting the airports, like Hong Kong protesters targeted here. And now we're seeing it on the streets of the US. And it's interesting, I have one of my Twitter threads is sort of a detailed video breakdown of how Hong Kong protesters stop tear gas. And I've watched that thread sort of have a life that sort of follows around the globe as various spots of civil unrest that break out. I see that Twitter thread being retweeted. First it was in Indonesia, and then it was in Lebanon, and now it's being picked up in the US. So it's interesting to see the way that the Hong Kong protesters have been not only learning, but teaching other protest movements around the world.
Well, and in fact, the book opens with this wonderful discussion of tear gas, of its use and abuse, the experience of it, how people cope with it, and this sort of thing. So again, a very rich section of that book. Now, one of the things that you just, that you, in your prepared remarks, focused on was this question of lawfare, the use of law to rule instead of rule by law. And as an attorney, we shouldn't be surprised, but also rule of law has been at the center of this discussion. And rule of law is essential to that maybe no democracy, but liberty formula. And so perhaps you could explore this a little bit, because one of the things that did happen last fall is people challenged the government's ban on face masks, for example. So maybe you could say something about the legal community to which you belong, and how the legal community, almost 20 years ago, but also just last spring, took to the streets.
Yeah, I mean, one of the key competitive advantages that Hong Kong has compared to the rest of China is its legal system and its rule of law. And that's something that the government itself talks about when it's promoting Hong Kong. It's something that investors talk about. Hong Kong has a independent judiciary, a transparent and effective court system, a predictable legal system that is similar because of the colonial heritage to legal systems that are familiar in the US and the UK and in other common law jurisdictions around the world. So it's a key competitive advantage of Hong Kong, and everyone recognizes that, including the Hong Kong government itself. One of the concerns that the legal community here has, and indeed other observers and protesters have, is that in using the legal system the way that they do, in using it for lawfare and in putting it to their own purposes, their own uses, the government is putting a pressure on the rule of law in a way that may ultimately make it break. And I think that the national security law is a classic example of that. The government in Beijing is relying on its own interpretation of the basic law to say that it's empowered to make this national security law for Hong Kong. The Hong Kong Bar Association has come out and says that, frankly, it doesn't agree with Beijing's interpretation of the basic law. We had a similar controversy a few weeks ago when Beijing's representative officers here in Hong Kong, the Central Government Liaison Office, sought to make certain statements and interfere in the legislature here. People pushed back and said, well, Article 22 of the Basic Law says that Beijing is not allowed to interfere in Hong Kong and it should be autonomous, to which Beijing responded, well, we think that doesn't apply to the Central Government Liaison Office because they should be allowed to supervise Hong Kong. In these ways, Beijing and also Hong Kong government continue to press and push and twist the law. And the fear of the legal community is it can only be twisted for so long until ultimately it breaks. And all of that faith in the legal system is gone, and with that, Hong Kong's competitive advantage. And so because of that and similar developments historically, the legal community has at certain times come out in protest. It happened in 1999, the first time that the Beijing imposed an interpretation of the basic law in Hong Kong. It happened again in 2014, and very notably it happened last year with the proposed extradition law. The legal community gather and have a silent march, marching from the court to the government headquarters. And those are very solemn occasions. There are no slogans or placards. There's no chanting. It's just the members of the legal community are usually dressed in dark suits, walking silently. Very powerful moment, and a very powerful, if you will, cry for help for Hong Kong's legal system from the people who are there to implement it and safeguard it. And so certainly the concern of lawfare is that it may serve the short-term purposes of justifying whatever action the government's taking, and in their minds, they think enable them to justify it to the world or to the community in the world by saying, well, all we're doing is upholding the law. All of you agree that's a good thing. But ultimately pushed to beyond a certain point, it's going to result in Hong Kong's rule of law breaking.
Yeah, you put it very well, right? Rule of law means that even the government is restrained by law, and that there are procedures, and it's not just a matter of strength on the streets. If I could combine a couple of questions. We've got quite a few in the forum here, and one is this one that we hear from Beijing all the time, that the problem is the cost of housing. The problem is economic opportunity. The problem is young people simply don't understand that they are part of a great grand story, the China story, that they don't see themselves as belonging to the nation. Now, economics, identity, what brought people to the streets? What combination of impulses?
Look, there's no denying that Hong Kong does have certain economic challenges for many of its population. Yes, housing is too expensive. Yes, social mobility is restricted. And yes, there is a high degree of economic inequality. In fact, by some measures, Hong Kong is one of the most unequal places in the world when it comes to social inequality. And so, yes, all these problems exist, but it is a rather too convenient explanation for the government that this is the reason why people are protesting. If only they could, afford a decent flat, that everything would go away. And all you have to do really is go out on the streets and listen to what the people are chanting and talk to them. in 7 months, not once did I hear anyone chanting, I want an affordable flat or I want better job opportunities. They are chanting for democracy and human rights and political rights. And if you talk to them and in fact put these issues directly to them and say, well, why are you really here? Are you worried about economic opportunity, all these things? They'll say, no, that's not the reason I'm here. And the government is wrong about that. And I mean, not only do they sort of directly say no, but you can also see that from the kind of people that attend these protests. It's not only young university students, concerned about their future. It's not only, people in their 20s who may not be able to find a job. There are many middle-class professional families attending these protests, people who are supposedly winners from the system, lawyers and accountants and bankers who are out there protesting. They own a flat. They have great jobs, but they're still coming out to protest. And so, clearly, it's not just that. There are much deeper issues of identity and political rights and freedoms that are at stake that's bringing people out.
Last September, we brought together a number of pollsters from Hong Kong and talked about this and more or less asked the same question. And they said, no, you have to, when people say this is why they're in the streets, this is probably why they're in the streets, right? You have to actually take these comments seriously. Now, we have, again, many questions and more are welcome, but let me see if I can get to a couple of them. One is this question of what can others do? What can, when I say others, I mean people outside of China, outside of Hong Kong. What can others do? And there are some people that worry that the nuclear option with regard to stopping treating Hong Kong as a separate customs region, breaking off other special privileges that Hong Kong enjoys that are not available to the rest of China, those sorts of things. Many people worry that that actually hurts the folks who you are trying to benefit. What can others do?
It's interesting that there is actually even a diversity of opinion on this among Hong Kong's protest community themselves. Some on the more moderate side, and such as the pan-democrat politicians, and indeed Jimmy Lai, a very prominent business person, a media mogul, but also a very prominent pro-democracy figure in Hong Kong, in the New York Times last week, wrote an op-ed saying, I hope that the US doesn't take this step because that would take away Hong Kong's economic edge, and that's the one edge we need to keep over China. So there are some indeed among the protesters in Hong Kong or the pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong who feel that way, that they don't want Hong Kong to be hurt. On the other hand, there are some other members of the protest community, particularly the younger, more radical activists, who sort of say, bring it on. And they've got this saying for this, Lam Chao, it sort of is summarized in the Hunger Games slogan, if we burn, you burn with us. And their view is, burn it down. They sort of say, only by destroying Hong Kong will the true nature of Communist Party rule be revealed. Their ultimate aim is to sort of, bring the whole system down and then be able to rebuild Hong Kong from the ground up. Again, a slightly extreme idealistic argument. But as I say, on the ground in Hong Kong, these are the kind of debates that people are having. So it's then therefore difficult from an international community's point of view to sort of say, well, what do you want us to do for you? What do you want? But I think at least the most important and immediate thing is to keep attention on Hong Kong, to keep people watching and talking about Hong Kong, to keep governments continue to speak out on Hong Kong, because I think the best we can do is to at least stop the Communist Party's own worst tendencies. And Beijing does care about their international reputation. I mean, it's important not only for Hong Kong's economic status that its international reputation is maintained, but also Beijing under Xi Jinping is very ambitious. They want China to be a global leader. They're expanding through their Belt and Road Initiative. They're trying to build China up as a responsible stakeholder in the global order and as a superpower. And so part of that is having an appropriate international reputation. So as much as they give the impression that they don't care and they're going to do what they want regardless, I think in some ways they do. And so keeping up the attention and keeping up the pressure, I think helps to moderate the way that Beijing handles Hong Kong. And I think that's ultimately in the interest of the Hong Kong people. And ultimately, it's much much more in the interest of the Hong Kong people to have the world watching than to have the world not watching. So continuing to watch, continue to pay attention. If you're so inclined to liaise with your elected representatives and make sure that they and the government is doing so is all helpful. And I think ultimately also listening to the Hong Kong people themselves and what they say they want is also going to be important.
Now, well, and your book, of course, helps us to better understand what's going on, what the key issues are, what might come next. When we talk about China, we often talk about the question of performance legitimacy. The notion that because the government is competent, the economy growing, all of those things pre-COVID-19 that we did highlight. Often, that's discussed with regard to Hong Kong too. Hong Kong famously rooted out corruption and has built a hyper-modern city, public transit, all of these kinds of things, with very little in the way of any sort of natural resource, right? Mm-hmm. And so, what happened? What happened? And we have a couple of questions that ask this with regard to the chief executive, with regard to the police, with regard to the legislative council, all of these different things. What has happened? We still see pockets of competency and delivery of services, but what has happened in Hong Kong's leadership?
That's a great question. I think it's one that many people in Hong Kong sort of ask themselves. I mean, I think clearly, structurally, the way that the Hong Kong government is set up is sort of faulty at its very foundations. The idea that you have this what's referred to as an executive-led government, but the executive themselves is sort of the accountability mechanism is warped, so that the chief executive is selected by this small circle election committee and is ultimately accountable to Beijing and not accountable to the Hong Kong people. And so it's then stuck in this impossible position where he or she is required to try and please the people of Hong Kong, but at the same time to try and please their masters in Beijing. Hong Kong's leaders really since 1997 have been constantly looking over their shoulder, trying to second guess what Beijing may want them to do. And it's resulted in Hong Kong being governed first in the interests of Beijing and what Beijing wants, second in the interests of the tycoons, who are really the people that put the Hong Kong chief executive into her position or his position, and then last of all, the Hong Kong people. And so this has sort of really caused so much of the failures of governance. The city hasn't been governed in the interest of its people. It's governed with views to these large, white elephant projects that might benefit the property developers or decisions made to sort of help Chinese enterprises that want to help here, but the people and livelihood issues have been really neglected by the government. And so this sort of malaise has crept into governance of Hong Kong over the last 20 years since the handover. I mean, it's also striking that you're quite right. There are pockets of competence when the Hong Kong government takes an initiative and tries to deal with it properly. It can do so well, as indeed with the handling of the virus that they seem to have done very well, although many in Hong Kong credit the community themselves with their high awareness of these issues after the SARS outbreak of 2003 and this very high community mobilization around this issue that's helped with that as well. But yes, it's something that puzzles people here in Hong Kong as well, and I think it's something that perhaps is structurally a problem which can only be resolved with a proper government democratically elected in terms of universal suffrage. But I think that's something that unfortunately doesn't look like is on the cards for Hong Kong. No,
well, the whole question of universal suffrage in the sense of having a real choice, that's what drove the protests in 2014. And Beijing has not budged on that. The notion of having a government that's more accountable, more transparent, those sorts of things, that's, of course, what brings people into the streets. Now, Antony, I will just take a moment or two more of your time, your Friday morning. Thank you so much for sharing with us. But we have a couple of questions from people who are originally from Hong Kong, now resident in the States, and others. And they're looking, you get a sense of desperation. And that was one of the things that you highlight in your book, the sense of mortality, and that, this is unlike 2014, where there was kind of a festival quality to some of the events and those sorts of things. You've gone the stakes just seem higher and higher. And one question from Leanne Olden from the University of Toronto is, where do we go? What is the political and economic future? Another question comes from somebody from Hong Kong who says, my friends have given up on working within the system and are thinking about more dramatic measures, perhaps more violent measures. Where do we go?
Yeah, very good questions, and thanks for the question from Lynn. And I recommend to you her LA Times op-ed of, I think it was yesterday, looking at some of these very questions. It's a great question, and you could see this sense of desperation on the streets in the course of last year's protests. The changes of imagery, the use of the slogans, the things that people would talk about. It's clearly many people view as desperate times, and talking about potentially the death of Hong Kong in various ways. And there are various, I guess, possible outcomes or ways in that could be manifested. One is, as the questioner pointed out, the possibility of more extremism, and a historical parallel that many people have been talking about in the course of last year's protests was, of course, the Northern Ireland parallel. And would we reach a point in Hong Kong where we have these sorts of extreme reactions or extreme outcomes of this kind of, we already have a deep division in society, and how much further would that go? Something that of course no one wants to see in Hong Kong. But look, it happened before in 1967. We had terrorist bombing campaigns on the streets of Hong Kong. So it's something that is, when you game out what are some of the possible futures for Hong Kong, you can't neglect that as one possible future. The other thing that, in particular, in the weeks since the national security law was announced, the last couple of weeks, is this thought of a possible brain drain. And many people have been making inquiries about emigrating. I've heard among my friends, young professionals, talking about is now the time to leave. I think that would be really a tragedy for Hong Kong, that its best and brightest would leave. And just to, I guess, go back briefly to the demographic point, you mentioned you had the pollsters on, and that was something that I think came out very clearly through the polls of the protests last year, that when you looked at who was supporting the protesters versus who was supporting the government and the police, people who supported the government and the police were overwhelmingly either of old age brackets, of age 65 plus, or people with only primary school level education. Whereas people who tended to support the protesters were in the young demographic, sort of 18 to 35, 18 to 40, and people who were tertiary educated. And so you sort of see this social division in terms of age and socioeconomic status, and it'd be fair to conclude that those groups haven't shifted much in the last year or so. And so when it comes to the national security law, the people that is going to be alienating is, again, the young and the educated middle class, exactly the people that are the best and brightest of Hong Kong and the most important to its economic future. And to have the government now alienating them and putting many of them into a position where they feel they have to emigrate is really a tragedy for Hong Kong. Although it may end up being to the benefit of the places they go to, if there's now suddenly these vibrant Hong Kong diaspora communities in the US or the UK or Australia or Canada. So it's another possible future for Hong Kong. I mean, the other, I guess one of the other possible futures, and I suppose the one that the government hopes for, is that, people just learn to live with it and all the fuss dies down, and people just carry on. But I think that it's impossible to avoid the chilling effect that comes with this. And already people talking about, scrubbing their social media accounts, talking about what they will and won't be able to to talk about, write about, or publish, or indeed in academic circles teach in the future. People talking about, would the Tiananmen Vigil be allowed to continue in the future? And all of this has a dampening effect on society. And I think whatever happens, I think there's going to be a period of some depression, if we want to put it that way, spiritual depression in Hong Kong, as it tries to learn to live with whatever it is that the way the government wants to refashion Hong Kong, which clearly is contrary to the wishes of the people themselves.
Thank you for this incredibly sweeping response to an impossible question, touching on the demographics, the spirit, the identity, and who's in which camp and what the future might hold. You covered a lot of questions. One of my USC colleagues has asked, about brain drain questions. Will the universities in Hong Kong continue to be of the stature that they are if people choose not to remain? Those sorts of things. One last question. And again, thank you for your generosity in joining us today. And is one country, two systems dead? Is it over? When we looked at the 5 demands from the protesters last spring and fall, those mostly seem to fall within acceptance of one country, two systems. Now, when you're talking about Hong Kong independence and revolution, things like that, that pushes those territorial integrity buttons that you highlighted in your presentation. But without the rule of law, is there two systems, or is it just one country?
And I think this is a great question, Clay, because it touches on, I think, one of the very central problems with the problem of Hong Kong as it is, and that is the understanding or the interpretation of this key phrase, one country, two systems. And I think one of the fundamental problems that exists is that the way that Beijing understands that phrase and the way the Hong Kong people understand that phrase are diametrically opposed. You hear again and again statements from Beijing that without one country, there cannot be two systems. And from Beijing's point of view, it is only willing to accept the existence of two systems subject to the precondition that everyone in Hong Kong acknowledges that they're part of the one country. Whereas in Hong Kong, the exact opposite is true. The Hong Kongers say, we're only willing to be part of the one country if you let us do that under a separate system. And so they're both approaching the same question from completely opposite ends. And I think what we're witnessing now from Beijing's point of view is a remaking of that phrase, one country, two systems, or a remaking of the expectations around what that phrase might mean to be closer to the way Beijing sees that, which is first and foremost, economically, Hong Kong is a capitalist system versus the mainland being a socialist system. And that was always the first thing and the most fundamental thing when Beijing came up with this idea, when Deng Xiaoping came up with this idea back in the 80s. That's what it was driving at first and foremost, the different economic systems. The various other parts of the infrastructure that go around that, a separate government, a separate court system, a separate currency, those sorts of things, will remain in place. But the other stuff, the soft stuff that in fact people in Hong Kong and the rest of the world see as more important, Beijing sees as less important, and I think is wanting to bend to their direction of their understanding, which is the rights and freedoms, which is can Hong Kong be used as a base to freely criticize Communist Party rule in China without repercussion? Can Hong Kong truly be a place where you can write and publish whatever you want, or express artistically whatever you want? These are things that Beijing has always been somewhat uncomfortable with, something that they tolerated under sufferance for the first 20 years of the handover, and perhaps now they are looking to crack down upon. So when you sort of ask that question, is one country, two systems dead? I think the way to look at it is, from Beijing's point of view, it's they're pushing it in directly or exactly the direction they want it to go. But the consequence may be for many people in Hong Kong that is leading to the death of one country, two systems as they understand it.
Antony, thank you. This is the definition of Maodun. This is the definition of a contradiction, right? This, this collision. Friends, all of you on the line right now, get this book. It's really extraordinary. You could certainly do very well. There it is. There's the cover. Sitting on fire, I could hold up my Kindle version of it, but you may be less impressed.
It will be available in paperback in the US at the end of June, so a couple of weeks.
So very, very soon, and well worth your time. Thanks to everybody who is here, who has joined us, has given time. I think that you've all benefited, as I have, from Antony's deep insights, his experience. There's so much to be gained. I want to welcome everybody to make sure you're on our mailing list. Sign up at china.usc.edu. Join us next week when we're talking to Professor Margaret Lewis about criminalizing China. But please join us in offering a virtual round of applause for Antony. Thank you so much. I can't wait to have you here in Los Angeles and to be able to share with you a U.S.-China Institute mug in gratitude.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing you there.